We now move on to the practical application of these theories of Finnis natural law and Hoose proportionalism. And to do this, we're going to look at the syllabus suggested topics of immigration and capital punishment. And this is the more detailed syllabus content on those two applied ethics issues. Let's start with capital punishment. There's a variety of means of actually executing somebody. Illustration here is the guillotine, not one that's been used in the UK, but certainly popular in other countries. Starting with some basics, the definition of capital punishment is the legally authorised killing of someone as a punishment for crime. So you need to be careful that you never use the word murder in this context, because murder is the illegal killing of somebody, and capital punishment is thereby, by definition, not illegal. So it therefore cannot be murder. So it's the question, the discussion that we've got is whether in fact the state should legally authorise the killing of somebody, but it certainly isn't murder when they do so. It's also incredibly important not to conflate a particular means of execution or the way a particular country has applied capital punishment with the issue itself. There's a whole range of ways of executing people, going from some ancient ones like crucifixion and impaling on a stake, both of which were designed to make the dying process last as long as possible and be as painful as possible during that process, through to more modern methods which generally aim at a pretty swift inflicting of death on the person, removing the head by guillotine or by cutting it off with an axe or with a sword or a knife, firing squad, lethal injection, hanging, electric chair. There's a variety of methods. So when we're looking at this, the crucial issue is whether whether killing somebody should be allowed, whether that is a moral thing to do. Well, we're in the realms of law here, so we need to make sure it's not about an individual executing somebody. It's about whether the government, the state, should be able to pass laws which say that somebody should be killed. Then once you've done that, you've then got to work out the most effective means, and of course it depends on what you're planning on doing. When the Romans and the Persians went for crucifixion and impaling on a stake, the means was very specifically devised to stretch out the dying process. When more recent capital punishment has been used, the purpose has simply been the killing and swiftly and cleanly as possible. It's also incredibly important to separate out the concept of capital punishment and the way it is then applied, very particularly the way that America has in recent decades applied capital punishment is, as far as I'm concerned, utterly bizarre, and one of the cruelest applications of capital punishment I think that has possibly ever been, because the way that well, let's go for the standard first. The usual approach to capital punishment is somebody is tried, found guilty, and then they're executed, potentially pretty well straight away. And certainly, if this is the normal way of doing this, is after you've been sentenced to death, then you'd be executed within a few days at most. That's the normal way that this has been applied. And at times it's been taken from the court where you've been found guilty, sentenced to death, and you just take from the court somewhere to then be executed. The way the Americans have done it is the exact opposite of this. And so what they do, they have a trial, the person's found guilty, they're sentenced to death, and then they go and sit on, we have standardly known as death row, and they can be there for absolutely decades. And during that time, they are, their death, the date of death is given to them, and so they're preparing for that. And then somebody says, no, we're going to appeal it, and then they're told, no, actually, we're not going to execute you next week. You're going to sit on death row for another 5 years, and then they're given another date for their death, and then in a few days before that comes up, oh no, we're not going to execute you on that day. That is a fairly standard method of torture that is used by sort of hostage takers as a standard one, where you tell somebody you're going to kill them, and then in fact you don't kill them. So one of the things as you're discussing this is really just don't use the modern American model for this, because that is absolutely no argument either way, because it is just a ridiculous way of applying the capital punishment model. Now, as you apply Finnis natural law theory to capital punishment, it's complicated. You've got to have a nuanced and holistic reading of the whole of his 7 basic goods, 9 requirements of practical reason, which of course don't give specific ethical guidance. And so what you end up with as you apply these, it looks like you've got these mixed messages about capital punishment, because you're going to the 7 basic goods and the 9 requirements of practical reason, and it appears to be giving arguments for both for and against capital punishment. And absolutely central to this model of working, and don't forget, we're in the sort of territory here of virtue ethics. It's not something that the smart 13-year-old is ever going to be able to manage. What you need here is wisdom, and in the main, wisdom comes with age. And so even you guys at sort of at 18ish, are you going to struggle to have the required wisdom to be able to really get a grip on how this should be applied. Before we get into the details of looking at Finnis and Hoose in terms of capital punishment, it's worth just having a look at how that fits within a much wider understanding of response to crime in general. Now, it's important to bear in mind this is a huge area of study in its own right, and it's way outside the syllabus, so we're not doing it, but we need some basic concepts to engage with the topic. And the first one of these is that punishment as a response to crime is not inherent. There are other responses to crime. An obvious one is something that would fall into the general term of rehabilitation. Even if you go for the punishment model, there's 2 quite distinct ways of understanding what punishment is for. Now, one is deterrence. It's a consequentialist model. In other words, the purpose of the punishment is about consequences. The purpose of the punishment is preventing that person committing crime in the future, because it deters them. They think, oh, I'm not going to do that again. And it's also about deterrence of others committing the crime, because they will have seen the punishment and they will say, okay, I'm not going to commit a crime because I don't want that to happen to me. Consequentialist model. A very important element of this is that you can quite easily do the calculations on this and say, is there any evidence that whatever your response to crime is, it is preventing reoffending in that individual, and it's preventing others from committing crimes. That's the deterrence model. Now, there's another model which is completely and utterly distinct from that, and that's the retributive model. Now, don't conflate this with revenge. It's possible that you've got an element of revenge in it, but there's certainly absolutely no requirement inherently within a retributive model to have any sense of revenge. But what you've got in the retributive model is, for want of a better term, it's a balance the scales of justice model. You've put a crime in one side and in the other side of the balance you put punishment, and that balances the scales. Now, of course, these are completely sort of metaphysical scales. You can't actually go and find them anywhere, which is a bit of a problem with this model. But one of the incredibly important aspects of this is there is absolutely no requirement at all in this understanding for it preventing further crime, for it to be counted as effective. Now, that's just not what it's trying to do at all. It is very simply an understanding of balancing the scales of justice. Very archaic, very, very ancient, very deeply embedded within the human psyche. It's an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth type of model. And the most important element of this is it cannot be challenged on the basis of this model is showing no evidence of preventing further crime, either from the person themselves or it having any impact on others, because that is not even remotely what it is attempting to do. Looking then at trying to apply Finnis ideas on capital punishment. Now, fairly obviously, as you look at these, you're going to find some which support and some which don't support capital punishment. And some of these, as you try and play with this, some of it gets a bit complicated and a bit forced, possibly. And so we start with life. It's pretty basic, really. You can't get more basic than life itself. And so, okay, so if you are murdered, then you can't pursue that, and capital punishment prevents further murders being committed by the person who is executed. Okay, look, another one, friendship and sociability. This one is about pursuit of the basic good. It's about the interest of our friends. If our friends are threatened by an existing killer, then it's in their interest that that killer's life, or that killer, is prevented from killing. And so therefore, that's an argument. So, well, if the killer is executed, he's not going to be a threat to anybody anymore. So that's a way of, it's very, these two almost feel forced in terms of trying to sort of make the basic goods support capital punishment in terms of going through them one step at a time and trying to apply it to the issue. And then as we look at requirements of practical reason supporting capital punishment, equality, so basic goods should apply equally to all people. Self-interest is legitimate because I am part of that all people. So my interests count, and I don't really want murderers in my community, and so removing the potential threat from a murderer by executing them is good for others. And similarly, as we look at community, this is about producing the common good of the community. Basic goods are about allowing individuals within a community to flourish, and so then again it's permanent removal, capital punishment of murderers, whatever else you might want to have capital punishment for. Rapists, personal pet one of mine, people who steal motorbikes, is for the common good of the community. But you can then do pretty much the same thing as you look through the basic goods and see, well, if you can use these to oppose capital punishments. Well, you look at life, and this is a fairly obvious one. This is a basic good. It's about the importance of life. Well, capital punishment goes against it because, well, it's killing somebody. So that's preventing that basic good for the person you've just executed. Practical reasonableness. Now, this, of course, here, using one's intelligence to solve moral problems. This moves back to something I said right at the beginning. This is not about something that the smart 13-year-old can deal with, because this is somebody using their wisdom. So when it says intelligence there, this is maturity, wisdom, using your life experience to solve moral problems. And this is absolutely embedded within this virtue ethics tradition, which is where this natural law model is coming from. And so you could then say, well, here we go. So you could use your practical reasonableness. So, well, capital punishment does not seem to act as a deterrent. Now, whether that's true or statement or otherwise, you'd look at data on that. This is one of the factors why capital punishment is not practiced in UK. It does, of course, if you want to take that line, it's completely ignoring the retributive model of capital punishment. And so therefore you could say, well, you know, as you apply practical reasonableness, you say the pursuit of this basic good would suggest capital punishment is wrong if you're working on a deterrence model. But you can see how complicated this comes because you've got to work out which model you're going to work on. You've got to argue between your deterrence and your rehabilitative model and your retributive model. You've got to decide which of those you think is correct, and then you've got to identify whether you think practical reasonableness stands most strongly supporting any one of those three, and then how does that practical reasonableness deal with the very specific issue of capital punishment within those. And then a requirement of practical reason, again, you know, don't harm. You shouldn't do an act that directly harms a basic good, even if it will indirectly benefit a basic good. So this is you can't justify a means by the end. The end doesn't justify the means under this model. And therefore, fairly obviously, one reading of that is, so well, you shouldn't kill somebody by capital punishment because it's breaking that basic good of life, even if it will potentially save more lives later. So that's saving, supporting the basic good of life model there. But again, it depends on what model you're working with as to whether that is valid. And you say you shouldn't have capital punishment, should never be carried out because capital punishment would harm this basic good of life. Now, if we remember, you've got Finnis arguing that we should accept a legal system. That's we have a moral as well as a legal obligation to obey every law. Just recap on that. You know, I want to pursue the basic goods. Society needs coordination in order to create the conditions that allow everyone to pursue the basic goods. The law is an effective way of coordinating society in this way. Therefore, I ought to obey the law. Now, if we take that line, there's an element whereby you just accept the status quo. So that, you know, the law's there, it's been put in place, those sanctions have been put in place for those that disobey the law, and so therefore whichever way the society's gone on capital punishment, we should accept that because following the law is the best way to achieve the common basic goods. So there's an element there by that stepping back and just going with the status quo rather than the line which we were using earlier, which is critiquing the status quo, critiquing the way that the law has been put in place. Let's now have a look at capital punishment in terms of proportionalism, and just a bit more background on capital punishment, just to get some context here. The last execution in UK, 1964 by hanging. Spain was 1975. In France, the last execution was 1977, and that was guillotine. They still use the guillotine. In Germany, it was 1981, and in Poland, 1988. Now, all of those are well within my lifetime, and the Polish one is, and some of the other Eastern European ones, Russia and places like that, into the 90s. So not quite in your lifetime, but don't think of capital punishment in terms of the illustrations I've got here. The one you're looking at the moment is Anne Boleyn, and you know, the one on the Finnis was an 18th century French guillotining. But this is contemporary history. This is definitely your parents' living memory without any difficulty at all. There's some countries in the world, of course, which still execute people today. So just be careful in thinking about this, that it's something from the distant past. It's not. It's something from the very recent past, and in fact the present for some countries. So looking at this in terms of proportionalism, and let's look at this in terms of Roman Catholic theology. Now, Roman Catholic theology is against the use of capital punishment. Now, to make that statement, it's incredibly important to put in here contemporary, certainly not historically. The Roman Catholic Church has not only been in favour of capital punishment, but it has used it quite extensively at times in pursuit of its own ends. Anyway, the one that we need here, 2015 Pope Francis. Today, it does emphasise today, the death penalty is inadmissible, no matter how serious the crime committed. Now, what Pope Francis looks like he's done there is he's closed off a use of proportionalism to justify execution, because he's got here no matter how serious the crime committed. Just bear that one in mind as we look at the example at the end of this PowerPoint. So we've got Aquinas then. Aquinas' natural law can also be seen as against the death penalty because it goes against the primary precept of preservation of life. Now, there's an element here whereby you've just got to be engaged with this. Stating completely obvious. There is nobody who no one within Christianity is allowed to positively want the killing of anybody. And so the idea that the death penalty goes against the primary precept of preservation of life is to some extent stating the completely obvious, and also you could say is not actually relevant, because capital punishment, the whole point of it is it's stepping outside the norm. It's saying that this particular individual has stepped so far outside the norms of civilized society and decent behavior that we have no option but execute them. And that's for most stable societies that have got any lasting value. Then execution has always been, it's a bit of a last resort. If you've got execution as a very casual thing, it rather loses the value of the execution. So and this by no means a universal view. So this Aquinas natural law, even that is not embedded fully within Roman Catholic thinking. There's no shortage of people who would argue for capital punishment on the grounds of preservation of life, or more likely the ordered society. That an ordered society has got to have laws. It's got to have at times very strong laws, and execution could be seen very easily as a statement as to just how badly this person has stepped out of line, such that the only valid response is to kill that person, and that then becomes a very important event, almost a sacred event, and it's about ordered society. Quite a common view even today. It's not entirely clear if you had a referendum on capital punishment in modern societies. It's not absolutely clear that all of them would come down on the side of banning capital punishment, which is probably why it's never put to a referendum. Now, with proportionalism, then, it's only got any value in a deontological system, and so your starting point for proportionalism is you've got to have a deontological rule that you are wondering whether you're going to apply or break. And so our deontological rule, fairly obviously here, is that Roman Catholic teaching says capital punishment, contemporary Roman Catholic teaching, capital punishment is now morally bad. There's your rule. And then we move on to the axiom of proportionalism, which is it's never right to go against a principle unless, and the unless of course is absolutely central to proportionalism, there's a proportionate reason which would justify it. And so what we're saying here, we're back into standards of proportionalism. Due to the moral ambiguity of the world, we've got this due to the ontic evil. There are occasions where you've got this pre-moral evil, bad, non-good act, which could be considered a right act if it creates the lesser of two evils. Now, we keep coming back to this. Note it's not saying it becomes a good act. It's a right act because it's the lesser of two evils. So if you've got a proportionate reason to carry out the non-good act, it remains non-good. It might be the right action in that specific situation, but it doesn't make it good. It makes it a bad action, a non-good action, which is the right one in that context. So therefore, what you've got, the idea is there are some acts of capital punishment which may be justified as right if the moral agent or the state, the moral agency of the state, believes that there is proportionate reason for doing so. And here you've got to have the intention, situation and consequences suggest that for all its wrongness in this particular situation, that capital punishment is in fact justified, is a proportionate response. So let's look at the example then, and it's a fairly extreme one. It's got to be, otherwise you're not going to push something like capital punishment. It's got to be a very extreme one before you're sitting on that border of saying, dear me, are we going to abandon that rule that says no capital punishment? So here we go. We've got this example. I didn't think this one up, so I'm not quite sure why it's got a woman in it, but I thought it was a good one. So let's go for sex equality here. Inclusivity, we've got a woman murderer, and she's already admitted to murdering 30 people. Absolutely central here, for no other reason than it gave her pleasure. You know, we're in sort of Moira Hindley territory. Here, one that was known as the Moors murderers, and she and her mate Ian Brady used to they abducted children from the streets of Manchester in the 60s and took them up on the moors, tortured them to death for their sexual gratification, and taped the proceedings. That's audio tape. Taped the proceedings so they could listen to them later for their own sexual gratification. So you've got this sort of character around. Okay, so here we go. So she's in prison. She's admitted to murdering 3 people purely because it gave her pleasure. Then in prison, she's killed 3 more people, including 2 innocent prison guards. Okay, so we've got this very obviously extreme situation. If it wasn't extreme, proportionalism just wouldn't kick in. You'd just be saying, well, no, we've got a rule, no capital punishment, and we'll stay with it. So would this constitute a proportionate reason for executing the woman? You might want to stop at this point and just reflect yourself on that. Okay, now fairly straightforwardly, morality, here's our rule. Catholic theology believes capital punishment is a non-good act. So there you go, there's your rule. Okay, let's have a look at the idea of value. Well, the intention of this capital punishment is to do what? Is to stop the prisoner committing more murders. Thus, it's upholding natural laws, preservation of life, and the 6th commandment, do not murder. So the consequence of capital punishment will be that lives will be saved. One thing is certain, if she's been executed, she's not going to kill anybody else. And potentially those lives saved will go on and reproduce, therefore supporting the natural law, primary precept of reproduction, etc. So what you're wrestling with here in this, again, I emphasize it's very extreme moral situation. It could be that the value of carrying out the capital punishment outweighs the disvalue. So we're in the realms here of the lesser of 2 evils. You've got to be saying, no, there's a proportionate reason to break that theological rule, to carry out the pre-moral evil. And therefore the bad act, no, forget we stay, your capital punishment is bad, it's non-good act of capital punishment. But in this specific situation, it could be justified as a right act. And I keep coming back to this, note the killing has not become good. The capital punishment is not good. It could, however, be considered to be a right action. So we'll look now at immigration and the application of Finnis and Hoose to this question. Now, before we get into any sort of details of this one, just so I've got some case studies, for want of a better term, which is worth reading these and thinking them through. What would you say are the issues involved? If you just looking at your own personal views at the moment, which, if any of these, would you feel comfortable admitting into UK to be permanent residents, and very importantly, why have you made those decisions?